Hello and welcome to the Work of Thy Hands podcast, where we interview Christian creatives, conversing on the ways they have seen their creative projects as co-creative efforts with Christ, times they have drawn inspiration from the physical creation, and their thoughts surrounding the nature of work as a creative. I'm your host, Allison Ramirez, and today I'm thrilled to be welcoming our next guest to the podcast, Heather Dickinson. Heather is a sketchbook artist who teaches art in Catholic education, which paved the way for her conversion from Protestantism. Her modus operandi is to get people drawing and enjoying nature while connecting with their own creativity. Welcome, Heather.
Hey.
Last week I had John Kramer on, and he does Lego creations. And then now this week I have you doing
Mhm.
art and sketchbook work. Everybody else before was a writer, author. So I love that I'm getting to hear about some other creative avenues. So tell me about how you got into being an artist and your sketchbook drawings.
Well, my grandmother was an artist when I was a kid. She did oil portraiture and Western landscapes, and so I had a lot of experience growing up, just being in that kind of environment. She would babysit me a lot, and so I would just hang out in her studio, and so I just naturally gravitated to drawing and all of these sorts of things. And of course, she was exceedingly supportive whenever I needed art supplies or anything. She was just like, here you go. She, in a lot of ways, she taught me most of everything that I know. And I really was considering becoming a professional artist when I was getting ready to graduate high school. And then that fell by the wayside. I ended up going for an English degree and doing a whole bunch of other stuff. I worked in agriculture for 16 years, and about 3-4 years ago, well, actually about 7 years ago or so, I decided I wanted to start getting back into doing art. I was kind of this phase of my life. There'd been a lot of changes and things, and I was just like, well, who am I really? I guess midlife crisis without it being a midlife crisis, I guess. And so I just started, it's like, what did I enjoy when I was a kid? And what did I used to do? What were my hopes and dreams and things? And so I went on this little self exploration journey where I just wanted to find out. It's like, well, who am I really? Do the things that I'm doing today really align with who I am as a person and who God is calling me to be? And it led me back to art. And at that time, I hadn't touched anything artistic in like 15 years. So, because I had graduated high school, I went to college. I was just really, really busy, and it just fell by the wayside. And so about 7 to 10 years ago, I started picking up art again, and I was like, I really like this. I really do enjoy this. I feel more alive when I'm doing this than I do when I'm doing other things. And so I found time to do art whenever I could. And I would put the kids to bed and then work for a couple hours in the evening at the kitchen table and just all this sort of stuff. And then about 3-4 years ago, I found myself in a position where I had to start over from scratch. And so I moved to where I'm at now in Eastern Washington, and was just like, okay, now what? And of course, me being me, I'm like, here's my chance. I can rebuild the life that I really am passionate to live, because that was a big thing for me. I was like, I'm done with being in situations that just feel like they're strangling my soul. And it was like, I know by this point, I felt very strongly that I felt like God wanted me to be an artist. And so it was like, let's do it. I've got this clean slate. Let's go for it. And so that was really when things started taking off for me. I put myself back into college. I got a master's degree in education and started taking courses. I got trained through Cornell as a botanical illustrator through one of their botanical illustrator programs. I did a 6-month art ministry program. And, it was like whenever I could scrape together funds from here or there or wherever, I was reinvesting it into art education and just loving it. And I found myself with an opportunity to apply to the local Catholic school as an art teacher. And the funny thing was, and I know this was a God thing, because I had looked at that position like 5 times and I was like, I'm not qualified. I'm not going to do this. I was just really hesitant. Well, so at the time I was finishing up my master's degree, and as part of education training, you have to do what they call clinical practicums. And so you have to get permission to go into some teacher's classroom, and then you sit there and you observe. and you take notes, and then you have to go back and write papers like for your professor on like professional dispositions and like all kinds of stuff. It was near the end of the school year, and I needed to do like 4 of these observations, and I knew I was running out of time. And so I wrote to the school where I was working, which was a public school at the time. And they were like, it's too close to the end of the school year, go somewhere else. And so then I wrote to the next school and the next school and the next school. I wrote emails to every school in the 50-mile radius saying, can I come in? Can I observe? This is what I'm doing, all the stuff. Everybody turned me down. The only place that said yes was the Catholic school. And so I walked into the Catholic school. I'm on my way to the front office, and the first person to meet me says, "Oh, you must be here for your observation. Did you know we're looking for an art teacher?" And I was like, "What?" And then I walk into the front office, and I'm like, "I'm here to check in." And I go through, all the process and everything. And then they're like, "By the way, we're looking for an art teacher." And I'm like, "Okay, 2 times. 2 times. This is not really a coincidence." And so then I walk down the hall and I walk into the art teacher's classroom, and he says hello, and then he looks at me, he kind of gives me the side eye, and he says, "I'm retiring at the end of this year." And I was like, I don't know that I'm ready for this. And he's like, "We'll see." And so then I did these observations there. I found that I just really hit it off with the people and the students and the environment and everything else. And then of course I came back in the next week to finish out my observations, and the art teacher, he was like, "So, have you put in your resume yet?" And I was like, no. And he says, "I'm going to keep bugging you." And so I decided I was going to apply. And then I went through the process, and I was hired, and I have never looked back. And this is the end of my second year. I'm getting ready to go into my third year, and I love it. I love it. And it's been such a blessing to me, because it's like I get to share what I'm excited about with other people, and just like everything. It's so yeah, that's how I got into doing the whole art thing. It was, kind of born out of moment of self-exploration that just kind of, I followed the breadcrumb trail.
I love that whole story about how you loved art from when you were young. And then it sounds like, you ended up majoring in English and you were in agriculture for a time. You did all these other things. And then, like, 15 years down the road, you got back into art. And so I love those stories, when people try a lot of different things and then there's always like that inkling in the back of your mind, like, this is what I really love to do and what I'm really passionate about. And that's, yeah, like similarly for me, I've also had several types of jobs, like working at a parish or working at online homeschool academies or working in like administrative positions. And like for me, I always come back to writing and editing. Like that's what I really love to do. And so that's so neat that you're able to do that and that doors were just opening for you, like for that teaching role that you're in now. Maybe share a little bit about how your faith inspires your artwork, because I think in your bio you mentioned that you actually converted to Catholicism from Protestantism.
Process. I will be official next week.
Oh my gosh, congrats. That is so exciting. Wow, so it sounds like then you got that job at the Catholic school and you're Protestant at the time.
Yes.
So then you probably have a whole other story of like your conversion experience that goes into that. But anything you want to share about your artwork and your faith and anything you think is relevant, or feel
So,
free to.
regarding the whole conversion to Catholicism, I mean, yeah, I was a Protestant when I first started working in Catholic education. I'd been non-denominational for about 5 years at that point, and have always just had a soft spot, for Catholics. And I mean, when I was growing up, I had several Catholic friends, and I've always felt, of course, this is the artist's eye, the artist aesthetic. I've always felt drawn to Catholic churches because they are, to be honest, they are so much more beautiful than most Protestant churches. And so I've always had that soft spot. And then when I started working at the Catholic school, that's when you get to work with people really closely, you really get to see, who they are, how they walk out their faith, and that's the point when, if there's insincerity, it starts to show. And I've been in that situation a lot. I was a when I was a Protestant, I was a worship leader for several years. It's very easy to, when you're sitting in the pew or something, that you have this idea of who somebody is. And then when you start working more closely with them and stuff like that, then it's like the veneer comes off and you can see whether they're genuine, whether they really do have a heart for the Lord, whether they really are doing the thing. And, and I'm sad to say that I've had several experiences in various denominations where people were not really what they appeared to be, feeling that disappointment, feeling that letdown, and going through that process of, it's like, how can they say they're serving God when they're doing other things on the side. So then, when I started working in the Catholic school, it's like, that's what I was expecting. I mean, to be honest, it was like I was expecting, okay, this is great, but where's the catch? Where's the insincerity? Where's the other, the not so picture perfect type things. And so I went in, I was cautious, because it was like, I mean, after you've been burned a few times, you're always going to be kind of cautious. And it's just like, I expected them, to have stuff and to not be as sincere as they put out professionally. And then I was surprised, because the more I got to know everybody, the more I settled into my position as an art teacher and as a part of their school and community, the more I was just really surprised at the level of genuineness that I encountered, and the sincerity, and just the way that they took following God so seriously. And especially, coming from various non-denominational sects and things like that, uh, there are people who seem lackadaisical about the Christian life. It was like, I didn't find any of that here. All these things that I had been expecting, like, I didn't find them. They weren't there. And instead I found people who genuinely loved God, genuinely wanted to follow him, and were doing their best to, like, live the talk, walk the walk. And around this time, because like I said, I had Catholic friends growing up and everything, so I've always had a soft spot. That was when I really started to question. I was like, okay, God, I know you put me here for a reason. I know that this was intentional. This wasn't just a coincidence. And then I was like, I'm seeing these people just live out the faith in really, really beautiful, meaningful ways with such intentionality. And I was just like, there's something here. There's something here that's different than everything else I've encountered before. And so I started really just kind of questioning. And I went through the summer, and I was just kind of, mulling this over. And then around the time that I started my second year, I was deep in prayer, and I was just kind of asking God, I'm like, where do you want me to be? Where's the, I'm supposed to have community, what are you doing? And God said, I've already given it to you. Look around, Heather. And I was like, oh my goodness, it was like this moment where I was like, mind blown, and it was like, oh my gosh, he has already given it to me, and it's right here. And so then I was like, okay, so if you've given me this community, what do I need to do? And that was when I really started looking at conversion, and it's just been a very smooth, ascent up the mountain ever since. So that's been pretty cool. As far as my faith inspiring my creative work, our God is a creative God. And since we are made in his image, we're also creative. And I feel like, for me, being creative, being artistic, that's the moment when I am most honoring him in whose image I'm made. And so for me, being artistic, being creative, it's not just me sitting down to draw something. It's a way of having that intimate fellowship with God himself.
Yeah, I like your emphasis on community, and that
Mhm.
was the catalyst that really got you looking into Catholicism. And I think that speaks to the importance of, yeah, actually living our faith in an
Mhm.
authentic way. And like you said, not being one way at church and then another way in the rest of your life. And I think that just goes to show that in our faith, being those good witnesses, because you don't know who you're going to be positively or negatively impacting, like people around you. And for you, yeah, you were seeing like people that were really genuine and they wanted to grow in their faith, and that really inspired you, and actually sounds like really was that what got you on the path of wanting to
Yeah.
convert to the faith. So Yeah, I think that's a really good reminder for all of us to like look at our lives and, make sure that we're truly, living how we want to be living, both at church and outside of church and everything. So
Yeah, because you never
that's
know
great.
who's watching.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's so true.
I mean, they didn't know that I was, they didn't know that I was going to eventually convert when I walked in there. All they knew was that I was a believer and
Mm.
that I was okay with working in a Catholic environment and supporting Catholic values and ideals. I mean, that's all they knew. They didn't know that I was eventually going to take the steps to join the church. So,
Right. Yep. Well, good. Well, I'd love to hear also about how the physical creation inspires your work because I like to talk a lot about that on this podcast. And us both being in Washington, we see a lot of the beauties of the Pacific Northwest. And you mentioned in your bio that you like to help people through drawing to enjoy nature.
mhm.
So, tell me about some of the themes in your artwork.
So, I worked in agriculture for 16 years, and when you live and work so closely with the land, there's just a lot of things that you realize that most people don't understand. And they don't understand not because of ignorance or anything like that. It's more that they haven't experienced it. They don't understand. They don't understand the delicate interplay of species and the land itself and how everything like coexists. I mean, we kind of get the bird's eye view when we're going through school and they teach us biology and stuff in classes, but it isn't really until you are relying on the land for your livelihood, for your way of being, that you really come to understand how everything fits together. And I mean, I'm seeing that tide kind of shift a bit lately. There's a lot more environmental awareness. There's a lot more awareness about how the prevalence of different species over others impacts, how things work in the natural world. But it's a little bit different. I feel like as Christians, are one of the very first things that God gave us to do was to steward the land and to steward it well. I mean, that's why man was put in the garden, was to take care of it. And so I feel like, as Christians, we have a unique call to see these, to protect and steward like our wild lands and um, promote a more holistic way of living and working, you know, in the land and everything that way. And so, as far as that goes with my work, a lot of my artwork is inspired by nature. I mean, you can flip through my sketchbooks and there's nature drawings, there's drawings of natural landmarks and different features and things. And for me, like making artwork and drawing is part of my learning process. It's like that's how I really grasp concepts, is by getting them down on paper and just really meditating on, it's like, okay, so how does this work? Why does it look this way? Why this and not this other thing? And so like I'm diving into all those questions as I'm creating artwork. But it's like I feel like the arts have a unique aspect to helping that understanding in a certain way. And so a lot of my early work kind of jumped off of the work of John Muir Laws. He pioneered this idea of nature journaling, where you take a journal out, a sketchbook, you go sit in nature and you observe and you record your observations and you take those moments to just sit and absorb and come to a deeper understanding of how things work. And so a lot of my early sketchbooks and things were nature journals. I would go out on the four-wheeler to go check the cows and I would have my art supplies in a backpack, with a lunch. And then when I would stop for lunch, I would find a spot. I'd go sit down on a grassy hill and, poke around in the bushes and then draw for, 30, 40 minutes before I went on and continued, doing what I was doing. And, I feel like for me, that just increased a lot of my appreciation for God's creation. And then I found that, the deeper I went in my relationship with God, it supported that in a way, because I found myself praying as I was making artwork, as I was sitting in nature. I would pray and I would ask, like just sit and talk with the Lord. It's like, what do you want me to notice today? What do you want to bring to my attention? And I found out recently that the Catholics have something very similar to this, except it's with sacred art, and it's called Visio Divina, where you look at a piece of sacred art and you kind of begin this conversation with God. It's like, what do you want to speak to me about today through this artwork? And I realized that, this is a lot of what I do through my artistic practice when I'm out in nature. I go on a hike with my kids or whatever. We go hike 6 miles out into the underbrush, and I'm like, okay, God, show me something, talk to me today, please. And like, I'll go someplace, and then it's like, what do you want to talk to me about? And I feel like as I was engaging in the art, in nature, like, it was really deepening my relationship with God, because he would point out, like, for example, last year, one of the moments was, and I blogged and I posted about this on my Substack, was when I encountered some snow brush, I think is what it's called. The Erica Varia, I think is what it's called. Can't remember the name, but it was at the time of the year that I was there. It looked dead, but there were these white things on it. And so I pulled the car over, and I got out of the car, and I went over and I sat down next to this bush, and I was looking at it, and I realized they were flowers. And, as I was praying, it was, God then started unpacking this message to me about things look dead, but your time to bloom is coming. And it was just this really, poignant message of encouragement that I really needed at the time. And it's like things like that. That's where a lot of what I do has become so important to me. And it has become something I really want to share with other people, is because, this is a way that you can have a rich inner spiritual life. And a lot of what I was saying is that this is where a lot of my motivation to share with other people come in, is because I feel like, we know that God is speaking to us all the time, but I don't feel like we really know that he is speaking to us all the time.
Mhm.
It's like all these things that come together for.
Yeah. So many things you shared started getting me thinking about the Catholic tradition of, yeah,
Mhm.
beauty and artwork. And yeah, I love that when you mentioned, yeah, Visio Divina, because I was recently introduced to that form of prayer, maybe like 2 or 3 years ago. And I love it. Being able to look at an artwork, I think it really draws me closer to,
Yeah.
yeah, to Jesus. And or if I'm looking at an artwork of a saint, I think about the saint and their example and everything like that. And or if I'm looking at an outdoor scene, yeah, I really get
Mhm.
inspired by the intricacies of nature. When you're working with the kids in your classroom, what sort of art do you do with them? Do you do sketchbook focuses with them
Yep.
mostly?
I do insist that they keep a sketchbook, and I give them points for doodling in it, drawing in it. We talk about the
Mhm.
importance of having a sketchbook. A lot of what I do, because I teach fine art, is I focus on giving them the tools so that they can express what's inside of them. There's this idea around art education that, oh, you need to turn out the next Michelangelo, or you need to turn out the next Rembrandt. And, this very scripted way of, okay, here, we're going to learn how to do this drawing exactly like so and so did. And I want to move away from that, because the thing is if I learn to draw like Da Vinci, for example, am I drawing like myself? And I think, because I know you write, it's the same. Like, if you learn to write like Ayn Rand, are you writing like you?
Yeah.
You're not. You are writing like that other person. You're not honoring the voice that's inside of you. When I teach art, I like to focus on giving them techniques, giving them tools, giving them ideas for ways that then they can express. And typically, like, in terms of my class structure, I like to have my students do some guided work with me so that they can kind of grasp that mastery of those key fundamental pieces, and then I turn them loose. I'm like, you have what I call a self-determined project, and you have to come up with this idea from start to finish. And so sometimes I will say, make sure to use this technique because this is what we've been studying. Or I may say, focus on this particular element of art that we've been studying. And other than that, they kind of have free reign to explore and try and figure out, okay, how do I get what's in here out onto the paper? I feel like, seeing the work that my students have been putting out over the last couple of years, I think it's working because they are just it's like they're taking those tools and then they're using them to create some really incredible stuff. And I like that because then they're learning how to give voice to what God put inside of them, not what I'm telling them they have to be, or not what pop culture is telling them what they have to be. And I think that that's, in terms of, back to the relationship with God and everything, it's that I think how we can honor what he put inside of us. He didn't make us all carbon copies of each other. He made us unique, and he gave us little things that are unique and special, that then we have a particular grace to share with others. And so that's kind of my whole focus there. I try to break away from there's the idea that, art is either good or it's bad. I mean, to be honest, on some level, yes, there is good art and there is also bad art, but people get wrapped up in that to the point that it kind of becomes very limiting. And so I try to, move away where, art is more subjective. So, like what I want to hang on my wall is maybe not what you want to hang on your wall, and to kind of open things up for them a little bit so they feel a little more free to be able to explore.
Yes. Yeah, I love that focus on letting the children discover their own voice and their own creativity, because I think that even speaks to like our identity is made in the image of God, and God is so creative. God has so many faucets and ways that God expresses himself to the world. So, and that's the same with each of us. So, yeah, that's great. Well, good. Another a question, this is always a fun one, is do you have a favorite Bible verse, prayer, song, or person who inspires you as a creative?
That's a hard question.
I just like give a few options because I'm like, you can pick one or all.
Yeah, the Bible verse that stands out to me frequently is, I want to say it's Matthew 5:17. I might be missing on the address of it, but it's the one where he talks about, how we are the light on the hill, and you don't hide your light under a basket,
Mhm.
and you need to let your good works shine, as a light before all men, that they may glorify your Father in heaven. And to me, that's a big one, because that's what we're doing as artists. What I feel like we should be doing as artists is we should be, tapping into that inner spark that God put inside of us, and then just letting that shine, that then people would look at, like our artwork or things, and be motivated to maybe look for God. And in whatever form whatever form that artwork takes, it's like ultimately, it's something to glorify him, to point back to him. And so I think that verse is one that is inspiring to me. As far as prayers or people, I've decided to pick Saint Hildegard of Bingen as my patron saint. And I've been told she's kind of an unusual choice. I don't know. I've been drawn to her story because the thing that really fascinates me the most about her and really just inspires me is the way that her creativity was so multifaceted, and it was so holistic, and how I mean, she studied the medicinal plants and things and wrote books about that. Most everybody knows her for her music that she composed, that is still like some of the oldest surviving music written by a woman. But she's also an artist, believe it or not. I've got a book that I picked up a few weeks ago, all about her paintings that she did. And it's, all these lovely illuminated manuscript paintings that she had done to try and convey, the things that she was receiving via dreams and vision. And the fact that her creativity is so multifaceted in that regard, where it's like, she's so close to and so focused on God. It's like it's just pouring out of her in whatever avenue it can come out. And that's just really inspiring to me. I think as creative, we often collect hobbies. I know I've collected quite a few in my time. And it's just like, this idea that, yeah, you don't really need to focus on just one. You can let it just come out in whatever form it comes out in. That's something I aspire to, because when I was younger, there was always this emphasis where it's like, well, you have to pick one thing. You can't do art and music. You need to pick one. You can't do like theater and this. You have to just pick one, and this idea that it's like you have to just pick one to specialize in. And I remember just feeling absolutely frustrated, overwhelmed, and paralyzed. It's like, what do you mean I can only pick one? And so to look at somebody like Saint Hildegard, it's like, nobody told her she had to just pick one. It just flowed out of her. This beautiful creativity just came out everywhere. And It's wonderful. So that's inspiring to me. I'm like, okay, Heather, you can just relax. Like you can do art and you can do these other things too.
And I think as creatives, a lot of other people that I have talked to have said, yeah, I have so many different interests,
Hmm.
creative interests, and they're trying to balance all of them. And they say that, yeah, it actually helps with their creativity because they can focus on something for a while and then they can switch to something else so that they don't get stuck in a loop of just
Yeah.
this one thing, and moving on to something else also helps with their reignites their creativity.
Oh yeah, it never fails. If I run into a problem with, like with a painting I'm doing or something, if I get stuck, it never fails. If I pick up like one of my instruments and play music for a little bit, or if I sit down and write some poetry for a little bit, like it's like the flood waters break, the dam breaks, and then I'm like, oh, that's how I need to solve that problem. It never fails.
So true. Well, good. Well, the last question that I've started adding to the interview is, what would be your advice? This could be to other artists or creatives in general that
Hmm.
you'd want to pass along to our listeners.
Oh boy. I don't generally get asked for advice in this regard, but I would say to not be afraid to try,
Mhm.
because working as an art teacher, I also do contract teaching at different art studios in the community and things like that and whatnot. One common theme that I have seen is that a lot of people, they really, really, really desperately want to do the thing, but they are scared to try. And my biggest advice in that regard is, to remember that we all started in the same place. I didn't, just because I had an artist grandmother when I was a kid and spent a lot of time hanging out in her art studio, did not mean I knew how to draw a straight line when I was 5.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that I was able to do, drawings of, scientifically accurate drawings of plants when, like, no, we all started at the base level. You don't, like, if you're talking about writing, you don't come out of your mom's tummy knowing where to put a period in a sentence and when you should use a semicolon or a colon. Like, you don't know these things. We all start out fumbling around trying to figure out how things work. When I first picked up a guitar, I fumbled and it was awful. But it's like now I know how to do a standard chord progression and it's smooth and things like that. So it's like I would say don't be afraid to try, because we all started out not knowing anything and fumbling around, and it's okay. Nobody is expecting you to be the Rembrandt or the Picasso right out of the gate. And I always have to remind my students when I'm teaching, because like I get this a lot, because I do a lot of guided demos in my classes where I'm demonstrating techniques and then my students are following along step by step as I walk them through, this is how you do this. And invariably there's always one or two that is like, how do you do that? How do you do that so good? And it's like, slow down. You have to understand that I have a lot more years of experience than you do right now. And that's okay. Just because you're struggling with it a little bit, that's okay. Like I did too when I had your level of experience. And so I just kind of want to encourage people, don't be afraid to try. We all started at the beginning, and that and then to jump off of that too, Bob Ross said in one of his television episodes of The Joy of Painting, he said once that talent is merely sustained attention over time. And so the people that you look at as being insanely talented, they're the people who sat down in the studio and spent several hours painting every day. They're the people that, sat down with a journal and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. The musicians who sit down and they practice their instrument. It's like that's what talent is it's sustained attention over time. Time doing the thing over and over and over until you build those fundamental skills and continue to build those foundations. And so don't be afraid to try. It could be, you could be the next Michelangelo or the next Da Vinci. You could be. but you'll never know if you don't sit down and try.
Wonderful. I think that's great advice to close us out for this episode. Thank you so much, Heather, for joining me on the Work of Thy Hands podcast. Those of you who are listening, if you want to stay connected with Heather and her artwork, check the show notes where there's links to her email, Substack, and Instagram. We always close out with a lovely prayer that's meant for creatives. So we can pray that now in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Creator of the universe, how infinite and astonishing are your worlds, O divine imagination. You created a creator when you imagined me into existence. Breathe breath into so much dust. Let me lament for forgetting daily to rise up out of the clay. Free me from the deceit of the mundane and from the lure of comfort, which dulls all my given edges. Most of all, light of my life, forgive my blindness, open all my eyes, salt me with newness and in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.